What's up, guys? Welcome back to Michigan Muckraker. My name's Michelle. Today is June 14th of 2023, and I like to talk about Michigan news and politics, Industry 4.0, and books. And before you, I only had my husband to talk to, so I wanted to say thank you very much for being here and hanging out with me. And as much as I love my husband and I'm appreciative of being able to talk to him, it's much nicer to be able to talk to all of you. So thank you. Today, I wanted to talk about The Vision of the Anointed by Thomas Sowell. And if you've never heard of Thomas Sowell, he's a genius, born in 1930, so he's 92 years old now. And he wrote this book in 1995, out of 37 so far. He's still writing books, which is crazy. He's got one coming out later this year called Social Justice Fallacies. So pre-ordering that, of course. But this book in particular, I think, is his best book, the most relevant to today. And it's because we are plagued by this vision of the anointed. Industry 4.0 in particular, also called the Fourth Industrial Revolution, is exactly that. It is a vision from people who think that they know better than we do, and they are going to force us into making decisions that we don't want to make. And so I want to read a couple small bits out of this book, and then I want to watch this interview with Thomas Sowell from all the way back in 1995, just because I think that it's really important for my channel to get this understanding down of where exactly all of these policies are coming from and why it doesn't really matter what facts you show that say this is a dangerous path that we're taking. They won't listen, and he explains why very, very adequately in this book. Very well. So, we're going to start with the patterns of failure. This is on page 8, so right at the beginning. No spoilers, although this is full of data, so it's not really a spoiler book. A book that you can spoil, rather. A very distinct pattern has emerged repeatedly when policies favored by the anointed turn out to fail. This pattern typically has 4 stages. And real quick, the anointed ones, again, the World Economic Forum, the United Nations, European Union, any centralized, the Federal Reserve banking system, any centralized power, the CIA, right? They get to, the Central Intelligence, they get to know, but we don't. These are all anointed ones, okay? Stage 1, the crisis. Some situation exists whose negative aspects the anointed propose to eliminate. Such a situation is routinely characterized as a crisis. Even though all human situations have negative aspects, and even though evidence is seldom asked or given to show how the situation at hand is either uniquely bad or threatening to get worse, sometimes the situation described as a crisis has in fact already been getting better for years. Stage 2, the solution. Policies to end the crisis are advocated by the anointed, who say that these policies will lead to benefits result A. Critics say that these policies will lead to detrimental result Z. The anointed dismiss these latter claims as absurd and simplistic, if not dishonest. I'm sure that you've seen this pattern in your own lives in the last 3 years at least. Now, stage 3, the results. The policies are instituted and led to detrimental result Z. Stage 4, the response. Those who attribute detrimental result Z to the policies instituted are dismissed as simplistic for ignoring the complexities involved, as many factors went into determining the outcome. The burden of proof is put on the critics to demonstrate to a certainty that these policies alone were the only possible cause of the worsening that occurred. No burden of proof whatever is put on those who had so confidently predicted improvement. Indeed, it is often asserted that things would have been even worse were it not for the wonderful programs that mitigated the inevitable damage from other factors. Examples of this pattern are all too abundant. 3 will be considered here. The first and most general involves the set of social welfare policies called the War on Poverty during the administration of President Lyndon B. Johnson, but continuing under other labels since then. Next is the policy of introducing sex education into the public schools as a means of reducing teenage pregnancy and venereal disease. Does that not sound relevant? The third example will be policies designed to reduce crime by adopting a less punitive approach, being more concerned with preventative social policies beforehand and rehabilitation afterward, as well as showing more concern for the legal rights of defendants in criminal cases. Again, we've seen that quite often in the last 3 years, with criminals, not going to jail for very long, if at all. So the other thing I wanted to read to you really quick has to do with the second example that he was going to give. And I'm not going to read the entire thing, but this is important and applicable right now to Michiganders and pretty much all Americans across the United States. Although sex education programs have been sold to the public, to Congress, and to education officials as ways of reducing such tangible social ills as teenage pregnancy and venereal disease, many of the leaders of this movement have long had a more expansive agenda. As a congressional committee report noted gingerly, the primary objective of federal efforts in family life and sex education has been to reduce unwanted pregnancy rates among teenagers, while the primary goal of most sex educators appears to be encouragement of healthy attitudes about sex and sexuality. In short, however politically useful public concern about teenage pregnancy and venereal disease might be in obtaining government money and access to a captive audience in the public schools, the real goal was to change students' attitudes. Put bluntly, to brainwash them with the vision of the anointed in order to supplant the values they had been taught at home. In the words of an article in the Journal of School Health, sex education presents an exciting opportunity to develop new norms. Only in the light of this agenda does it make sense that so-called sex education should be advocated to take place throughout the school years, from kindergarten to college, when it could not possibly take that much time to teach basic biological or medical information about sex. What takes that long is a constant indoctrination in new attitudes. An example of such indoctrination may be useful. A popular sex instructional program for junior high school students aged 13 and 14 shows film strips of 4 naked couples, 2 homosexual and 2 heterosexual, performing a variety of sexually explicit acts, and teachers are warned with a cautionary note from the sex educators not to show the material to parents or friends. Many of the materials of this program shown to the people outside the context of the program itself can invoke misunderstanding and difficulties. This is 1995, guys. But we are now in the Great Awakening, so that's why we see it everywhere, and parents are getting involved everywhere. Parents who learned of this program and protested were quickly labeled fundamentalists and right-wing extremists. Holy crap, same thing. Even though they were in fact affluent Episcopalians in Connecticut. Here is an almost textbook example of the vision of the anointed, preempting the decisions of parents as to when and how their own children shall be introduced to sex, and dismissing out of hand those who with different views. Nor was this episode peculiar to this particular school. Similar things have happened all over the country. Parents are denigrated both in discussions of public policy and in the materials given to the students in the schools. A typical comment from experts is that sex and sexuality have become far too complex and technical to leave to the typical parent, who is either uninformed or too bashful to share useful sexual information with his child. This utter certainty of being right, even to the point of circumventing parents, is completely consistent with the vision. however inconsistent it is with decades of empirical evidence on the actual consequences of healthy attitudes towards sex, in quotations, healthy attitude towards sex, as promoted by experts. The key point about the sex education crusade, from the standpoint of understanding the vision of the anointed, is that evidence proved to be as irrelevant here as on other issues. Again, he's a genius. The way he says it and the facts that he presents are impeccable. And the only people that I have found that do not like Thomas Sowell do not like personal responsibility. They would rather blame everybody else for the problems in their life instead of owning it, owning their own choices and owning their life. And when you give you're giving your power away when you say it's other people's fault for your life. So just don't do that. Take responsibility. He is an advocate for personal responsibility, and I absolutely adore his genius, obviously. So I'm not going to read any more from that book. I will have a link in the description. It will be an affiliate link, which just means that if you click the link and purchase the book, I will get a little bit from Amazon, but the book doesn't cost you any extra. And you do not have to do that, of course, but I just wanted to, of course, be transparent. So we're going to jump in. And I got to put my headset on. Sorry. And this is The Vision of the Anointed with Thomas Sowell in 1995. This is an interview that he did. And his interviews are always awesome.
Hello, I'm Ben Wattenberg. On this edition of Think Tank, we will talk one-on-one with social critic and economist Thomas Sowell of the Hoover Institution. Tom Sowell's new book, The Vision of the Anointed, argues that the assumptions and beliefs of America's liberal elites have created 30 years of disaster in education, crime, and welfare policy. What are these assumptions? Are they wrong? Where are they leading us? A conversation with Thomas Sowell this week on Think Tank. Joining us today is Thomas Sowell, a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He is the author of many books that have cast a critical eye at American society, including Inside American Education and Race and Culture. His latest book, The Vision of the Anointed, Self-Congratulation as the Basis for Social Policy, has been called a broadside against the received wisdom of America's elite liberal intelligentsia. Tom Sowell, why don't you start out and tell us what the Vision of the Anointed is about? What is it?
Well, it's a vision that the problems that we see in the world are due to the fact that other people are just not as bright or as compassionate as they are. And that there are all these solutions out there waiting to be discovered, and that they have them. And that these solutions are to be imposed upon the rest of us by the power of government through taxation or in other ways. And what's really crucial about it is that their passion is so much greater than the passion on the other side, largely because what they have involved is more.
Who is the they?
Oh, the media elite, the academic elite, political elites. And the reason we can talk about their vision, even though they obviously vary in their opinions, is that the basic set of underlying assumptions about the world are very similar. And because these assumptions are the prevailing assumptions, the need to find evidence for them or to offer proof is much less. If something happens, they'll explain it in a way which will fit that vision. For example, when they find that prenatal care is less among blacks than among whites, and that infant mortality rates are higher, they immediately assume this is because of society's neglect, and therefore if only the government will step in and provide more prenatal care, that problem solves itself. But in reality, other groups have even less prenatal care than blacks and don't have any more infant mortality than whites. But they don't ever get to that second stage, because once they've seen something that fits their conception of how the world works, that's sort of the end of it.
Yep.
Let me go back to that idea of who the they is. I mean, in your cosmology, are these liberals? Is that what they are?
Yes, you have the New York Times, the Washington Post, Harvard, Stanford, the Edward Kennedys, all the usual suspects.
Let me.
But it's more than those particular people, because
No,
this
I
mindset goes back at least 200 years.
Who does it start with? What is?
I don't know where it starts, but
Okay.
you can find it in the 18th century. If you read William Godwin, Inquiry Concerning Political Justice in 1793, you have the whole vision laid out just as it was in the 1960s. But the 1960s were a crucial point, because that's when this vision became dominant.
This sort of arrogant vision that we know best.
Oh, yes.
And don't even have to subject it to normal forms of proof.
Oh, absolutely not. Absolutely not.
Let me read you something that Speaker Gingrich wrote in his book, To Renew America. He said, since 1965, there has been a calculated effort by cultural elites to discredit this civilization and replace it with a culture of irresponsibility that is incompatible with American freedoms as we have known them. Do you buy that? Is that basically what you're
Yes,
saying?
although I would limit that to those who are sort of at the top of this kind of thing, because further down the people believe things because so many others believe them, because they're in the air and so on.
Right.
You know, I was particularly interested in what he said was that it is a calculated effort. This now, do you believe that the people, the anointed, as you call them, are sitting around in a conspiratorial mode, calculating, as Newt Gingrich says, and saying, here's what we're going to do? Or do you just think they're wrong and this is what they believe, and they have this certain arrogance about it? Because it's two very different ideas.
This is why I made the distinction between the leaders and the others. I mean, I think that when people say things like, more American wives are battered on Super Bowl Sunday, you see, than any other time of the year, and there's not a speck of evidence for that. That is calculated, because there is no data that can even be misinterpreted that way. In other words, because there is no data, period. And so, yes, but I think that 99% of the people who believe it are not calculating.
That is a really important distinction, because, you know, compartmentalizing, wow. Not everybody is, of course, involved in the plan. Okay, the people at the top, like the Club of Rome, the Bilderberg Group, the World Economic Forum, they are calculating. But the people that adhere to those beliefs, that are, you know, sticking their hand on the ground with glue in the name of climate change, like, they have unfortunately been brainwashed, and they have this belief system that the ones that calculated it wanted them to have. I mean, they're in our education system, right? So they are the calculating ones at the top. But everybody else that's following it may or may not be malevolent and calculating. They may be ignorant.
And I think one of the reasons that it flies without even being challenged for evidence is that there is a certain vision of how the world is, and in that world, men are oppressing women, and therefore, when you say something like this, it fits the vision, and that's the end of it. There's no demand for evidence.
You have in your book sort of a series toward the beginning of how the actual process works of forming one of these ideas and selling it and rejecting the proof. Maybe you could just kind of march us through this as a model of it.
All right, there's a four-stage pattern. And in the first stage is what I call the crisis. And so we're hyped to believe that something is a terrible crisis for which something must be done. What was fascinating to me in doing the research for the book is that very often the thing that's said to be in crisis has often been getting better for years on end. But that gets ignored. Then the second stage is,
for example, infant mortality, to use one of the
well,
things
I'm thinking about teenage pregnancy and venereal disease. Those things were getting better. Teenage pregnancy was going down for more than a decade before sex education was introduced. Venereal disease, syphilis in the 1960s had only half the incidence that it had in 1950.
That's amazing.
So all these things are going down, yet we're said to need sex education to deal with this crisis. which is then manufactured. And again, this is where the calculated part comes in. Now, 99% of the people who hear this don't know that. But the reason they accept it is because they also share the same vision. And because this is consonant with that vision, they don't have to ask for evidence.
All right, so what's stage two?
Stage two is
the first one is there's a crisis.
Yes.
They establish a crisis, usually an artificial one.
Yes.
Okay.
Then stage two is the solution. You have a solution for this crisis. In this case, you have sex education in the schools.
And 99% of the time, the solution is bigger government. And so if you stick around in this channel, you will know that big government is the worst thing that can happen to us individuals. It's the worst thing for freedom. Bigger government is potentially the root of all evil. You know, people say money, but government involvement always messes things up. It makes it way worse for the individual.
And then at that point, you say, if we do this, this will lead to beneficial result A. The critics say, no, it'll lead to detrimental result Z. Stage three, you put it in the results, you put it in, and directly you find detrimental result Z, namely venereal disease and teenage pregnancy take off into the stratosphere. And then stage four is the fascinating part, in which they simply say, no, that doesn't prove that this was a bad policy, because there are many factors. There's complexity. It's simplistic to blame it on this. But they run through this routine on so many different things, including crime. Similarly, they said, you know, in 1960, Judge Bazelon said we just desperately need to have some kind of change in the criminal justice system.
I have to say it, you know, the last 3 years, didn't it not start as 100% safe and effective? And then in the end, they said, oh, well, it would have been much worse if you didn't do that. And it plays out over and over and over again. And so we need to know about this vision of the anointed, because that is what we're up against.
Now, in 1960, there were fewer murders than there had been in 1950, 1940, or 1930. But again, that was completely ignored. And so now we have the revolution in the criminal justice system. People say, no, if you have put these new things in, there'll be more crime than before. They put them in. Almost instantly, the declining crime rate turns around and heads up again. And they say, no, it's simplistic to blame this on this. There are the root causes and the neglect of society and all the rest of it. So it's heads I win, tails you lose.
The question is, do these people really believe and then just ignore evidence? The ones that are actually calculating, the ones, like I said, World Economic Forum, UN, Club of Rome, it's been going on for a long time. We need to ask ourselves, do they understand that these policies that they say are going to make it better are actually going to make it worse? That they're just lying when they say it's going to make it better, knowing their policies are going to make it worse because they want it to be worse. And then if that's true, why? Why would they want it to be worse? Why would they want teenage pregnancy to go up? Why would they want abortion rates to skyrocket? Why do they want these things if that is the case? Now, again, I'm asking, is it ignorance or malevolence? Do they really think, calculating that this is what needs to be done, that it's going to help? And then this is why it doesn't make sense. They ignore that it didn't help afterwards. So it's like, to me, it seems that they really are just lying and trying to make things worse. But why?
So to go to that earliest example that you gave, you think the increase in venereal disease was caused by sex education?
I don't have to even say that. I don't even have to believe that. All I have to say is
do you? But do you?
Oh, I think it's hard to explain otherwise. I mean, you don't get social changes that drastic in a few years without some particular cause. But the argument doesn't depend on that at all. The point is, they created the crisis artificially. The evidence shows there was no crisis, but they would not even subject it to any empirical test. If they want to show some other factor came in and really caused this, I'm happy to hear that.
Now, why would a group of
More
liberal
information.
intellectuals or politicians or media stars or whatever, why would they sit around and decide to dismember or dilute the criminal justice system if they thought in advance that it would raise the amount of criminality.
Oh, they didn't think that, but the point is,
They just thought wrongly that it would help.
yes, but it would also give them an enormously larger role than they had before. I mean, a judge who just sits there and applies the laws that have been passed by the legislature has a very minor role. But if he takes the expansive judicial activist role, then of course he's on the leading edge, and he can look for the hosannas and all the rest of it from the sideline.
How does this play out in the realm of something else you have written about, which is affirmative action?
Exactly the same
How does
thing.
that process? What's the 1, 2, 3, 4 on that?
I haven't worked it out like that, but certainly there is no interest whatever in finding out empirically whether things have been made better or worse for minorities as a result of this program. And in fact, if you bring them up evidence, they'll say, but things would have been even worse had we not done this. Similarly with the war on poverty, you can show how dependency on government was going down, poverty was going down before this program was ever put in. And within a few years, dependence on government was going up, and after a few more years, the absolute number of people in poverty was going up.
Yeah, I read that in your book, but the absolute number of poverty is not the relevant data. The relevant data would be the rate of poverty. And the rate of poverty, in fact, in the 1970s, I worked for President Johnson, so we have to establish there. You know, so I mean, the line we took was that during the 1960s, during the Kennedy-Johnson administration, poverty did in fact go down sharply. And then the rate since then, not the absolute number because the country has grown larger, the rate has sort of bounced around at about flat, somewhere between 12 and 15%.
Yes, but don't forget, this was sold to the country not on the grounds that if you transferred money from A to B, that B would have more money. That was not the argument. The argument was that dependency would be reduced, that you would, quote, invest in people, as Bill Clinton is now saying, now that people have forgotten what was said in the 60s. This will then, you give them job training and all those kinds of things, parenting skills, the whole bit. And this will then be an investment that will pay off in the future because there'll be fewer people dependent upon the government than there were before. And I go through a great number of people from John F. Kennedy to Lyndon Johnson, the New York Times, again, all the usual suspects. Said all these things.
Lyndon Johnson was not a usual suspect, Tom.
Well, he was the primary suspect. All right.
I love that he said that. You know, because I don't know obviously what happened, but Kennedy got killed probably by the CIA, and Johnson was like, I'll do whatever you say. And so the fact that Thomas Sowell here says that Johnson was a primary suspect, that makes sense to me.
Right. But the fact is that was never tested.
And funny.
And when there were all these
You're
wonderful
talking to a
retrospectives
Johnson
held down in Texas and other places about this, the first order of business is to evade the criterion that they themselves set up when they set this out. And so no matter what happens, if it's a failure by the original criterion, then we just find another criterion by which it will be a success.
Well, let's just examine that for a minute. I have a friend of mine from those old White House days was listening to, again, Gingrich shortly after we had this great Republican revolution in 1994. A great meaning huge, not necessarily wonderful. We shall see about that. And he kept hearing Newt Gingrich use the word opportunity. This conservative opportunity society, we have to provide opportunity. And I was talking to him, he said, you know, Gingrich uses that word opportunity almost as much as Johnson did, which is what you're saying, that was the rhetoric. It was called the OEO, is the Office of Economic Opportunity.
Yes.
That's what it was.
Still dealing with that today.
Now, so if
office.
liberals were talking about opportunity, and now conservatives are talking about opportunity, and I'm sure you're for opportunity.
All God's children got opportunity.
All God's children got opportunity. So what is your problem that liberals said we ought to create programs for opportunity? And in point of fact, I mean, just to, I won't say play devil's advocate, because I mean, a lot of the things that came out of the Great Society, I mean, building all those junior colleges and community colleges.
Oh, I would disagree entirely. I think that was a tragedy of the first magnitude.
That was a tragedy.
Yes.
Why is that a tragedy?
You have millions of people who have absolutely no desire for an education, using up billions of dollars of the taxpayers' money, and not only not getting an education themselves, making it more difficult to give an education to those people who came to college with an idea of getting one.
Now, you say they have no desire for an education. I mean, nobody is herding them into these community colleges and into the junior colleges and into the state university. I mean, they have a desire, obviously.
No, they do not, obviously, because lots of things go on in those places that are not education. I mean, where else can you find so many young people of the same age and opposite sex in one place? A nice, convenient place to be. But anyone who is taught in these, in a lot of these places, this ferocious desire for education as such is not terribly visible. And I taught at places where we've gotten, you know, the upper 10, 15% of students. I mean, UCLA and whatnot. Neither I nor my colleagues found this great desire for education as such. They wanted to be in ivy-covered buildings for 4 years in order to get more money when they graduate and have a good time while they're there.
So you think the great American ideal, which has really been shared by both parties and both ideologies over recent decades, to allow more people to get into higher education, that is a bankrupt idea?
Oh, to allow is one thing, but to subsidize people at enormous cost with no real sign that this is producing what we intend to produce.
When you say subsidized, I mean, you talk about a junior college, a community college. I guess that's subsidized. It's below cost tuition, but it does allow kids who do not have the money to go to Amherst or wherever to start a college education. I mean,
people did that before the Great Society. I did it before the Great Society. My whole generation did it before the Great Society.
You are saying that the great humanitarian political impulses of the 1960s have been almost without exception bad.
Well, there have been some good ones, but I'm saying that the assumption that on the education front, I mean, I would defy you to find a large number of people who've actually taught these students who really think that they're out there thirsting for knowledge.
Well, if you suppose they are thirsting for a better job, and we've set up a society where you have to be credentialed with a certain amount of college, so aren't they able to get a better job?
No,
because
this is the fallacy of composition. You know, if one person stands up in the stadium, he sees the game better. But if they all stand up, they don't all see the game better. As long as, you know, if you have a degree and the other guy doesn't, then you get ahead of him in the employment line. But we're not going to all get ahead of each other in the employment line by all getting degrees.
Boom. And that's where we're at right now, why degrees are worthless and college is worthless and it's a waste of money and a waste of time. Because exactly what he said, everybody stood up now. There is no reason to have a degree. You're not getting a leg up.
So this whole idea that, I guess, again, both liberals and conservatives are saying is that at this particular moment, 1995, we have to get more people into the education system because that's the way to compete. And we look at the data and we see that the people with more education are earning more money than ever before relative to the people with less education. That's all a fallacy of everybody standing up in the stadium.
People who fly on the Concorde, kids who've flown on the Concorde undoubtedly will make more money than kids who've only gone on buses. That does not mean if we put a lot of people on the Concorde, we're going to raise the national income.
We would increase the revenues of the Concorde.
Yes, and which they desperately need, of course, but that's another story.
All right, now, and just to review the bidding, you date the full-blown nature of this this situation sort of in the 1960s. Is that right?
Yes.
I mean, that's, everyone on the conservative side I mean, Genesis is mid-1960s. That's when the world started. I mean, and I'm not arguing with that.
Well, not necessarily Genesis. I would say the fall in the garden.
Right. Okay.
Now, I'm gonna go off on a little limb here, because he said the fall in the garden, and then it happened in the 60s, okay? And I have this other book here called The Windswept House. You know what? I'm going to switch over really quick so you could see it better. The Windswept House, sorry about the glare, a Vatican novel by Malachi Martin, okay? Now, this book is fiction, but it is based on, according to Malachi Martin, who was an exorcist for the Pope of the Vatican in the 60s. This was actually true, but he made it into a fictional story to try to save himself, but he died a year after. I believe during an exorcism, but don't quote me on that. But I want to quickly read this, because according to him, this is what happened in 1963. The enthronement of the fallen archangel Lucifer was effected within the Roman Catholic citadel on June 29th of 1963, a fitting date for the historic promise about to be fulfilled. As the principal agents of the ceremonial well knew, Satanist tradition had long predicted that the time of the prince would be ushered in at the moment when a pope would take the name of the apostle. That requirement, the signal that the availing time had begun, had been accomplished just 8 days before with the election of the latest Peter in the line. I'm not going to go read any more of that, but I also found it fascinating that somebody found all of the real names of the people in the book and created this list. And on this list is actually Klaus Schwab as a banker. And this is in the 70s, so I'm pretty sure the World Economic Forum really started going in the 70s. But I just found that it was all fascinating that it's all connected. I am not a Catholic, but my mother-in-law is, and so I have read a lot and watched a lot of sermons and such from Catholics, and I think that every religion has a truth within it to find that's valuable, and that different cultures have different ways of expressing truth. And so Catholicism is no different in that. There is truth to be found in each. So very interesting, at least from where I sit. We're going to continue on. 1963.
Okay, all right. Now, since the 1960s,
I need to switch this over.
The United States of America has won the Cold War, remained while a lot of people, including mostly conservatives, were saying, "Oh, America's lost its nerve," and because we're
I don't think it was mostly conservatives.
Well, I recall an issue of the public interest in the mid-1970s saying, "Has America lost its nerve?" A whole bunch of conservatives saying, "Oh my God, it's terrible."
Well, this is Jimmy Carter's era.
Well, maybe that's right. Since this terrible event 30 years ago, when the 60s dropped upon us, we've won the Cold War. We've continued to grow in affluence, in professional skills. We have absorbed about 20 million immigrants. We are the wealthiest, freest country in the history of the world. You would agree with all of that, roughly.
Well, I disagree entirely with your base period. Talk about began long before the 1960s. They faltered to a great extent under Jimmy Carter. They were resumed with renewed vigor in the 1980s under an entirely different kind of vision. But I'm talking about the social decline of the country, because the social decline is all the more striking because here is a country that is prosperous. You can't blame the crime rate on the fact that there's more poverty. There's less poverty. There's more affluence. It's not due to foreigners because, as you say, we've won the Cold War. All the normal things that you might blame all this on aren't there. It's not because of diseases, because science has conquered more diseases. It's all because of self-inflicted wounds. And I'm saying these are the people who inflicted those wounds, and this is why we shouldn't listen to them anymore.
Can't say it any better than that.
What are the nature of those wounds?
Thank you for joining me, by the way.
No.
The disintegration of the family, the disintegration of the educational system. And it's not going to matter. We'll be like the man who gained the whole world and lost his soul.
Is there a common root to all of those problems, other than you heard them from the anointed class? I mean, is there something? Is it big, is it big government? Is it big government? Is that what?
No. It's the notion that ordinary people cannot be trusted to make the decisions that they've been making, but these must be preempted either by judges in the case of crime, by the schools taking over the indoctrination of other people's children behind their back and against their protests, or what was the other one? The family, putting taking money from the taxpayers and subsidizing behavior,
He's a
as well as
genius.
encouraging it and legitimizing behavior that has turned out to be enormously self-destructive, undermining the family in 1,000 different ways.
I mean,
Tom,
this is 1995, and we are dealing with it, with all of that he said right now.
you
It's
write in your new
amazing.
book, The Vision of the Anointed, available at all bookstores, about the Teflon prophets.
Yes.
What is?
Well, I think my favorite is Paul Ehrlich, because he's been so consistently wrong on so many things. One, predicting mass starvation, I think was the 70s or the 80s, but predicting that we're running out of, running low on resources. And Julian Simon made this famous bet with him. He would offer to bet anybody $1,000 that they could name a set of resources and name a period of time. And at the end of that period of time, those resources would not be more expensive, as they would be if they were really running low, but would be either stationary or falling in real terms. And Ehrlich rushed in with his list of 10 resources, and he decided we'd come back at the end of 10 years. At the end of 10 years, not only was the bundle of 10 resources cheaper in real terms than it was before, every single resource he named was cheaper.
Let me raise a final point here. You make this vigorous attack in The Vision of the Anointed that we should no longer listen to these people. That's sort of the debate. They've been wrong. They don't prove their points. It's hurt us. Who should we listen to?
We should listen first and foremost to our own experience.
Boom.
You seem to act as if there must be alternative saviors. We should stop looking for saviors.
Thank you.
I mean, the society has not existed for thousands of years because it had a succession of saviors. It's existed because it has institutions and processes through which people can realize their own goals.
No, I understand that, but you are
freedom.
attacking people who would like to lead us and tell us how the world works.
No, they don't want to tell us how the world works.
They want
to take over the decision for us. They don't tell the parents how they ought to teach sex education to their children. They put this material in the schools behind the backs of the parents with instructions not to let the parents see it.
Okay, but
that's the problem.
But we live
That's the
in
problem.
an open and democratic society now.
How is that
Mr. and Mrs.
open?
John Q. Public are listening to this program, I hope, and they're saying, boy, that guy really makes a lot of sense. But basically, it's been a negative proposition. Don't listen to these people. Don't do this. Don't do that.
No.
Who
don't let
should
those people run your life.
Okay, but how do you practically?
I think it's a non-problem, Ben.
No, but
Look,
how
it's
do
a
you?
non-problem. Those people are adults just like you and me.
Okay,
they have been running their lives for thousands of years. They don't need me to tell them what to do.
Wait a minute, but this is a.
It's not a question I want to take over from people on the left.
No, but
I want them to continue to make their decisions as they see fit.
Right.
But stop trying to make decisions for all of us. Stop trying to push us into electric vehicles, for instance. Stop trying to force us to get a medical experiment we don't want. I can go on and on. This man, I love him. You can't say it better than Thomas Sowell. And the fact that he only has one biography written about him called Maverick is sad. So sad. By the way, Corey, thanks for joining me. And yeah, all of these problems did start. They started a long time ago, and I believe in, life is cyclical, but definitely the 60s is the most recent time frame of where things really started going downhill, and we are reaping what we sow.
But this is a democracy. They have to vote.
Even in a democracy,
Okay.
they can live their lives as they see fit.
Who should they vote for?
Oh, good heavens. They've been voting for whoever they wanted to without my help for 200 years.
But some of these people are voting for the people who are listening to these anointed people. I mean, I give my audience some advice. Tell them what to do.
Last year in 1994, without any help from me whatsoever, they changed who they voted for. So it's a non-problem.
You say without any help to you, but you and your confreres in the conservative movement, I think, have had an influence on.
But it wasn't because of this book, obviously.
Well, not because of this book, but because of your earlier wonderful books. Tom Sowell.
Good face right there at the end. Yeah, I think that you're absolutely right, Corey. It's because he's so smart, and because he is pointing out this vision of the anointed. The anointed ones own the media, and so they don't want us to be aware of it. But that's why I'm talking about it today, because I think It's extremely important because all the climate lockdowns that unfortunately are coming is because of this vision of the anointed. So this is kind of hard for me to read, so I'm going to be squinting. I can't zoom in even more. This is off Twitter, but I think this is awesome. This is from 25 years ago. Global warming, a lot of hot air. Pact to slow global warming, said the headline. Hold it. Who said the globe is warming? By sheer repetition, we have been conditioned to respond to the phrase global warming the way Pavlov's dog was conditioned to salivate when a bell rang. With all the hot air about global warming, have you ever heard how much it has actually warmed? Or where? Or since when? Probably not, because most of the orchestrated hysteria about global warming comes from computer models about greenhouse gases rather than from actual temperature readings. Computer models are no better than the assumption and theories that go into them. Garbage in, garbage out. Now, that same thing with AI, guys. Same thing with AI. Back in the 1970s, computer models were predicting economic disaster on the way. Since then, there has been one of the longest periods of economic prosperity on record. Incidentally, there were also predictions of global cooling back in the 1970s. A new ice age was on the way. Before you start planting palm trees in Minnesota, you might want to wait for some hard evidence of global warming rather than depend on computer models. Temperatures go up and down like the stock market. Moreover, some particular places are getting colder while other places are getting warmer. For some places, we have statistical data going way back, and for other places, we don't. This is very iffy stuff. Temperatures have been collected in cities for a long time, but this can be very deceptive because cities are generally warmer than the surrounding countryside, and cities have been growing in size over time, with concrete structures and paved streets replacing wooden structures and dirt paths. In short, places and structures that hold heat are glowing. Weather balloons that circle the Earth give a much more balanced picture of what is happening to temperatures on the planet as a whole. Data from these balloons do not show the global warming that politicians, environmentalists, and the media are hyping. Some experts say that global temperatures have actually gotten a little cooler, in fact. A lot depends on the years you pick as before and after. Global data show the Earth's temperature the same in 1990 as in 1980. However, the temperature went up and down in between. Pick a low point on these oscillations and the temperature has been rising since then. Pick a high point and the temperature has been falling. Before we get too carried away with all the big talk about science and experts, let's not forget that we are talking about a field that has trouble predicting whether or not it will be raining tomorrow. Genius. Yet, we are expected to pile staggering costs onto the American consumers and taxpayers because of speculative theories turned into computer models. That's exactly what we're doing right now. Michigan especially, because we've signed on to so many different climate promises that by 2025 we want to be down 30%, by 2020 or 2050 we want to be down 100% carbon neutral. It's like these policies are going to make our energy prices skyrocket. Some weather scientists may read the data differently from others, as has happened many times in the past and will undoubtedly happen many times in the future. Unfortunately, there are strong pressures at work to cause those scientists who proclaim global warming to come forward and for those scientists who think it is a crock to keep quiet. Money and power, right? Huge research grants are far more likely to go to those scientists who can scare money out of Congress than to those say that there is nothing to go crazy over. Moreover, imagine yourself a skeptic in an academic department that is getting big bucks from Washington to study global warming and come up with solutions. What's in it for you to publicly contradict your colleagues who are raking in the bucks for the whole department, some of which may be paying your salary? If you are a junior faculty member, you may never get to the senior faculty member if you rock the boat. One tip-off on the shakiness of the evidence behind this latest drive to expand big government controls in the name of global warming is that its advocates are saying we can't wait to be sure. That argument proves too much. Why couldn't we wait to be sure when global cooling was the hysteria of the day back in the 1970s? If we are going to let Washington grab more of our money and expand their power over our lives every time they can throw a scare into us, then look for a lot of people to be saying boo about a lot of things. And that's where we're at. We're totally there today. Another Thomas Sowell banger. Corey says, talk about orca whale. He's rocking boats 25 years ago. I know. He was definitely one of the best finds in the last few years. I used to read fantasy, a lot more fiction and nonfiction. Thomas Sowell, obviously. I don't have them all though. 37. I need to level up my game, but yeah, there's plenty of material in here to learn something amazing. It's great.
I think it's a classic example of the need for crusades. Now, many people are shocked by these emails. I'm not at all shocked by them. I read the original UN study years ago.
Real quick, for context, he's talking about the Climate Gate 2.0 documents that dropped, I believe, in 2011. And there is a link in this thread. And I'll have that all in the links down below after this video is done.
And I was just curious as to how they were going to deal with the question that the temperatures went up first, and then there was the increase in carbon dioxide.
Right.
Because you can't say that A causes B if B happened first. And so I read this, and I could see they were tiptoeing through the tulips and the way they phrased things and so forth. They couldn't confront that. And now we're finding out that they knew darn well they couldn't deal with all the evidence.
So it fits the pattern.
Real quick, Corey says, have you seen the movie documentaries Uncle Tom and Uncle Tom 2? I have not. Are they about Thomas Sowell? I will totally watch number 1 tonight if they're about Thomas Sowell.
Of a group of...
Oh, nice. Okay. I mean, it's sad that he's called Uncle Tom like Larry Elder, but, you know, when you think outside the box of what you're supposed to, that's what they call you. But yeah, I'll check that out. Thank you, Corey.
Intellectuals, climate scientists who have a very narrow competency, suddenly proclaiming that there's a crisis, scaring the rest of us, thereby creating a demand for their services.
Yes.
Not as
pharmaceuticals
climate scientists alone, but as a kind of high priestly caste that can tell us all how to live and save the entire planet, and in the meantime generate billions of dollars worth of government programs to fund their research initiatives. And so it's a racket.
Yes.
It's a racket.
All right.
But again, you have to take account of the ability of human beings to rationalize. I'm sure there are scientists out there who believe some or much of what they're saying, and there are other scientists who believe the opposite. But the ones who are pushing global warming are doing their damnedest to make sure that those who believe the opposite don't get heard in the public.
So shouldn't there be some large-ish body of climate scientists who say the data really does suggest that we're headed into trouble here, but precisely because my saying so as a climate scientist will look like special pleading, we as a community of scientists should be even more careful about being completely transparent, pushing the data out to the public. They should overcome the hurdle that it looks like self-pleading. Why isn't that taking place?
There's no payoff to that.
All right.
Imagine yourself as an assistant professor in some department where your senior colleagues were going to vote on your pay, among others.
Oh, wow. They cut that off. That was just a little bit of information on him. I thought that it was interesting. He was a Democrat until 1972 and then became an independent. And the last thing I wanted to share was this by Dr. Thomas Sowell, August 2nd of 2022. Again, he is 92 years old, guys. He was born in 1930. He's still kicking out a book this year, and he's got articles every now and again, but he's not doing interviews anymore, unfortunately. But yeah, August. This is an election year, But the issues this year are not about Democrats and Republicans. The big issue is whether this nation has degenerated to a point of no return, a point where we risk destroying ourselves before our enemies can destroy us. If there is one moment that symbolized our degeneration, it was when an enraged mob gathered in front of the Supreme Court and a leader of the United States Senate shouted threats against Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, saying, "You won't know what hit you." Yeah, wow, I forgot about that. There's so much going on all the time that the craziest things can slip your mind. There have always been irresponsible demagogues. But there was once a time when anyone who shouted threats to a Supreme Court justice would see the end of his own political career and could not show his face in decent society again. You either believe in laws or you believe in mob rule. It doesn't matter whether you agree with the law or agree with the mob on some particular issue. If threats of violence against judges and publishing where a judge's children go to school is the way to settle issues, then there is not much point in having elections or laws. There is not much point in expecting to have freedom. Threats and violence were the way the Nazis came to power in Germany. Freedom is not free. If you can't be bothered to vote against stormtrooper tactics, regardless of who engages in them or over what issues, then you can forfeit your freedom. Worse yet, you can forfeit the freedom of generations not yet born. Some people seem to think that the Supreme Court has banned abortions. It has done nothing of the sort. The Supreme Court has in fact done something very different, something long overdue and potentially historic. It has said that their own court had no business making policy decisions which nothing in the Constitution gave them the authority to make. Now, real quick, I'm going to continue this, but I will say that the overturning of Roe v. Wade was genius for the Democrats. They had nothing to stand on. Everyone was predicting a red wave until the overturning of Roe v. Wade. And then Democrats won. I mean, look at Michigan. We now have all blue for the first time in 40 years. And it's because of Roe v. Wade being overturned. So anybody that thinks that Republicans wanted that done, I'm sorry, but Democrats, it gave them their platform. Get out a copy of the Constitution and see if you can find anything in there that says the federal government is authorized to make laws about abortion. Check out the 10th Amendment, which says that the federal government is limited to specific powers if it was granted, with all other powers going to the states or to the people. And don't get me wrong, it should absolutely be up to the states, but the timing, we must question the timing. Why do we elect legislators to do what the voters want done if unelected judges are going to make up laws on their own instead of applying the laws that elected officials passed? This is part of a very long struggle that has been going on for more than 100 years. Back in the early 20th century, progressives like President Woodrow Wilson decided that the Constitution put too many limits on the powers that they wanted to use. Woodrow Wilson sold us to the devil. Centralized banking system. When he brought in the Federal Reserve banking system, he made it private, centralized, he gave it to cartels. Read The Creature from Jekyll Island. Woodrow Wilson was the worst president we've ever had, in my opinion. Yeah, absolutely, when he sold us out. The Federal Reserve and income tax. Woodrow Wilson was income tax, and he was prohibition. He was terrible. Claiming that it was nearly impossible to amend the Constitution, progressives advocated that judges interpret the constitutional limits out of the way. Hey, Jessica. Thank you for joining me. I appreciate it. This was just the first in a long series of sophistries. In reality, the Constitution was amended 4 times in 8 years, from 1913 through 1920, during the heyday of the progressive era. Yeah, that's when we lost it, officially. When the people wanted the Constitution amended, it was amended. When the elites wanted the Constitution amended, but the people did not, that is called democracy. Another great sophistry was using the federal government's authority to regulate interstate commerce to call all sorts of other things interstate commerce. In 1995, elites were shocked when the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that carrying a gun near a school was not interstate commerce. States had a right to ban carrying a gun near a school, and most of them did, but the federal government had no such authority, nor did the Constitution give the federal government the right to make laws about abortion, one way or the other. What both state and federal laws do have the right to stop is threats against judges and their families. This is not a partisan issue. The Republican governor of Virginia is providing protection to Supreme Court justices who live in that state, but the Republican governor of Maryland seems to think that harassing judges and their families is no big deal. Voters need to find out who is for and against mob rule, whether they are Democrats or Republicans. We are not going to be free or a decent society otherwise. Again, Thomas Sowell says it better than I ever could. This was the most recent post by him, and I will have the link to all his columns, posts, because it's important to educate yourself, and he is a very educated man, so read his works and level up. This is the book, Social Justice Fallacies, that's coming out later this year. I am pre-ordering it. I look forward to his work, and I hope that you learned something today. And now a lot of people have, you know what, I forgot about this one. And I do have time. If you guys want to hang around, I will read this one really quick because it's applicable. But yeah, if you have never read Thomas Sowell, let me know in the comments what you think of this first introduction of him. Will climate lockdowns be necessary to fight the climate crisis? Now, this right here, I forgot to show you. Bookmarks. Look at this. What do you think of that? That's up in Canada. It looks to me like they're starting the fires. Now, why would they start their own fire? Unless they wanted to bring about climate lockdowns. That's just one answer. Let me know if you have any other answers. Now, I've heard that this is controlled burn to stop the other fire. Now, I have heard of controlled burns, of course, but that seems kind of dangerous since it's so dry. Why would you add fire to fire at this time? But let me know. Corey also says, Thomas Sowell's a great person. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for hanging out, man. I really appreciate you guys. At the beginning of COVID-19, lockdowns were necessary to fight the deadly virus. See, now, again, this is Green Matters, so this is bull crap, but it's still important to understand where these people are coming from on the other side that think that lockdowns are necessary and that the government should ever be able to tell a private business that they can't operate. No way. To lower emissions, excuse me, another type of lockdown might need to be used. Climate lockdowns. And this was January of this year. So there is article, if you just type in climate lockdowns, there are tons of articles from different people justifying why we should be locked in our home by our government. It's nuts. At the beginning of COVID-19, lockdowns were a necessary tool for fighting off controlling the deadly virus. People stayed inside. We went to the store less, didn't go out to eat, and entertained ourselves at home, all to avoid exposure to other people. Another quick tangent. This is why I adhere to terrain theory rather than germ theory. If you go back to the origin of pharmaceuticals, it is all because of germ theory. It's this belief that we have these little diseases inside of us that our neighbors are harboring and that could affect us and could kill us, and therefore our neighbor is a threat. And for me, I look at outcomes of thought. If the outcome of thought is to fear your neighbor and to hate your neighbor, it's not a good thought. It is not a correct thought. It is not a godly thought, whatever you want to call it. So Germ theory is bullcrap, and it makes you fear your neighbor. Terrain theory means that you, or me, I am responsible for my health. No one else is responsible for my health but me. Personal responsibility, okay? So my terrain, what I eat, what I expose myself to in the world, you know, exercising or not, it's my responsibility. I am in charge of my health. That is terrain theory. So germ theory, I'm sorry, you can, Béchamp is the one that put forth terrain theory, and there is a book out there. I highly recommend you look into it, because some of the base thoughts that we have are wrong, and terrain theory versus germ theory is one of those. Don't fear your neighbor. Don't make them responsible for your health. You are responsible for your health. Sorry, tangent over. And for a minute, the Earth started to reflect those actions. Emissions started decreasing, and it seemed that something positive was emerging out of a negative situation. This experience raises the question, would climate lockdowns help us tackle the climate crisis? The Vision of the Anointed. That's what the climate crisis is. Oh, thank you, Pilot. He said, Michigan Muckraker seen last night meeting a Green Charter Township. Congratulations on your shout out in the meeting. Thank you. That was Jessica, actually. Thank you, Jessica. And I appreciate you watching that. It was lively for a couple minutes there. I'm going to go over that, by the way, in the Goshen News Roundup on Monday. But yeah, what is a climate lockdown? When the pandemic first started, one of the main goals was to flatten the curve. Lockdowns were an essential part of accomplishing that initiative. With a climate lockdown, the objective should be similar, staying inside in order to prevent emissions from increasing at an intense rate. I have to go back and say, if you look at the type in carbon is life. Carbon is the foundation of all life on Earth. Therefore, to me, this is logic. If carbon is the foundation of all life on Earth, then the war on carbon is a war on life, right? Correct me if I'm wrong down in the comments, but to me, you cannot convince me we need to decarbonize. Carbon is life, and life is beautiful, and we should appreciate life. So who or what is against life, is anti-life. What exactly should a climate lockdown entail? As we now know, simply staying inside would have an impact, but that one change might not be enough. According to the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, UN Agenda 21, a climate lockdown would entail the government taking other actions aside from asking people to stay at home, limiting private vehicle use, banning the consumption of red meat, imposing intense energy-saving actions, and putting an end to fossil fuel drilling are all examples of potential measures to be taken during a climate lockdown. Unbelievable. Limiting private vehicle use. I mean, they're just saying it. This is the vision of the anointed, y'all. You ready for it? You ready for the fourth industrial revolution? The main goal of these actions would be to lower global emissions as we get closer and closer to reaching 1.5 degrees Celsius, a milestone that would cause the effects of climate change to further worsen. Prove it! Where's the data? What are you talking about? Scientists are emphasizing the importance of necessity of staying below this threshold. What scientists? Not all of them, I can tell you that. Will climate lockdowns be necessary in the future? Hannibal, you just wait. I'll let you down in a minute. Despite scientists yelling far and wide, we still aren't doing our absolute best to decrease emissions and lower our impact on the planet. At some point, extreme measures such as climate lockdowns might really be necessary if no progress is made. You know, and I'm going to go back to this. The trash in the ocean, I'm all for cleaning that up. But it has nothing to do with carbon emissions. Corey asks, have you seen the new documentary about the Great Awakening? No, I've heard the term obviously quite a lot, and I use it quite often because I feel it. I feel that there is this great awakening happening right now, and I appreciate it. But it's also, it makes sense to me since the Great Reset is happening, equal and opposite reaction. You know, there are laws of nature, there are laws of the universe, and you can try to deny them saying non-binary, but the world is binary. It's ones and zeros, male, female, yin, yang. So I do not deny reality, or at least I try not to. But I will definitely check out the Great Awakening documentary. Thank you. You've been giving me a lot to watch. I appreciate that. As we have seen with the pandemic, getting people to work together towards a collective goal isn't always easy. Convincing everyone to wear masks and stay home wasn't as simple as sharing scientific data that proves the validity of these actions. I mean, this was written in January, guys. And there's been scientists after scientists from the beginning proving the opposite. Wearing masks doesn't do anything. In fact, there is a study now that says that wearing masks still to this day is what's causing long COVID. Because imagine that we're supposed to breathe in oxygen. Not old, stale oxygen, but fresh oxygen. And according to Wim Hof, we don't breathe in enough. We need to breathe in deeper and get more oxygen into our blood. If a climate lockdown becomes necessary, there's a chance that we could run into a similar problem. So even if this strategy was utilized, there's no telling whether or not it would actually be adhered to. Even though participation isn't guaranteed, we know that at least some adherence would make a difference. Not everyone stayed home, but emissions still decreased a bit. Our climate emergency is something hard to understand. Sometimes when something isn't directly visible, it can be hard to believe or conceptualize. This can lead people to think that immediate action isn't necessary, when it most definitely is, according to the UN. There's that vision of the anointed again. While some people didn't mind lockdowns during the pandemic, there are still a lot of people that did mind. Staying at home and not being able to go somewhere isn't all that fun. So if the idea of another lockdown, albeit a slightly different kind, isn't appealing, then we better start tackling climate change sooner rather than later. Ridiculous. This article is ridiculous. Of course, climate lockdowns, that's just tyranny. You're advocating for authoritarianism, and I just can't imagine that there are people like this, and yet I know them in person, some people. It's just a crazy time to be alive, but it is a good time to be alive because a challenge is a good thing, right? We don't want it too easy. I've said once before in another video, this is a video game for our souls. And so, you know, we're supposed to level up, and right now we're at the great battle of our time. And at the root of the root, it is a spiritual battle. It is a moral battle. And it doesn't really matter what government you put in place if everyone's corrupt. Because people, individuals, make up a society, not the other way around. So I really appreciate you guys hanging out, conversing with me, and I hope that you learned something. I certainly learned something, and I will continue to fight back against big government and against lockdowns and against this vision of the anointed. So, thank you guys. I'll see you in the next video.